It's been just over a week since Apple's M2 MacBook Pro has been out in the wild, and so far we've found 7 problems with it after 1 week, some that aren't as big of a deal, and some that have literally caused people to cancel their orders, which might actually be the right move here because man, Apple kind of messed up on the SSD situation. But before I get into that huge problem, let me first start off with some of the other ones that we've noticed over the past week. The first problem is that the M2 MacBook Pro uses exactly the same design with absolutely no changes, even keeping the same touch bar, which a lot of people did not like, including myself. Meanwhile, the MacBook Air gets a full redesign with so many updates and changes, a beautiful display that's a little bit larger with slimmer bezels, and basically an awesome new design. But with this one, Apple even reused old M1 MacBook Pro boxes and literally put a new M2 sticker over the old one, and that's definitely not what Apple is known for doing. This kind of shows that Apple doesn't really care about this product, or at least not enough to make some new boxes with an updated wallpaper to make people feel like it's a new product. Now for problem number 2, nothing else was upgraded in terms of the actual feature set. We have the same exact speakers, no changes, same keyboard, same trackpad, basically everything's the same. The display is the same, no changes at all. It even has the same 720p webcam, while the less expensive M2 MacBook Air is getting the 1080p webcam. That is a huge disappointment. Not only that, but this MacBook is the only one that now is not getting MagSafe 3 for convenient and fast charging. Now problem number 3 has to do with Apple's marketing, which is a bit overboard with this M2 MacBook Pro. First of all, Apple showed off that the M2 chip supports 8K H.264 and HEVC encoders and decoders. So this got me very excited, thinking that this M2 MacBook Pro is gonna be the best bang for the buck video editing laptop out there because it's equipped with the fan and it has the M2 chip with 8K encoders across the board. However, when we tested a 5-minute 4K HEVC export, which is very common, it was only 5 seconds faster than the M1 Pro chip, which has basically the same encoders as the M1. Now that is hugely disappointing because Apple never marketed the M1 Pro encoders as supporting 8K, but they did for the M2, and apparently 8K means 5 seconds faster. Now it is nice that Apple put in the ProRes media engine because it actually does help quite a lot, but the whole 8K H.264 and HEVC media engine part was way overdoing it compared to the 5-second difference that we actually experienced. Now yes, there might be some updates coming, but Apple should honestly be shipping the correct software updates right away while launching new products. You shouldn't have to wait until macOS Ventura comes out or future updates to use the machine at its full potential. And now moving on to problem number 4, we have thermal throttling. And there is a lot to unpack here, but I'm gonna start with how much power the M2 chip uses. In the Cinebench R23 stress test, the M2 chip's CPU used 36% more power to get 13% more multi-core performance, which is definitely disappointing because it shows that Apple really had to boost the clock speeds to squeeze out that extra performance improvement. And the issue with overclocking the performance cores that much is that it causes instability, which we noticed in our Logic Pro music production stress test, where the whole point is to run as many tracks as possible without overloading the chip. And the crazy thing is that the previous M1 MacBook Pro was able to run 81 tracks without overloading, while the new M2 chip overloaded while running only 76 tracks, which points to instability within the chip. And to prove that stability is what matters for the Logic Pro stress test, Intel's Xeon chips always performed much better in this test compared to the regular Core i9 CPUs that were actually faster in terms of raw CPU performance. So stability matters for this test. But that's not the end of the story because we experienced severe thermal throttling on this M2 MacBook Pro, more so than any MacBook we've ever used before. What we did was run an extreme stress test, which is exporting Canon 8K RAW from the Canon R5 to 4K HEVC. Now, I will admit that this is an extreme test that isn't meant for the target market of the M2 MacBook Pro, but I specifically wanted to max out the CPU and GPU as much as possible to stress out the cooling system as much as possible. And honestly, the truth is that a computer's cooling system, especially one that's fully sealed like this M2 MacBook Pro and not upgradable, should be able to properly cool down the chip that's inside of it without severely thermal throttling. Because if it can't, that extra performance is being wasted. And the thing is that we ran this exact extreme stress test on the previous M1 MacBook Pro, and the GPU was stuck at 100% load the entire time without throttling, while requiring the fan to be basically maxed out. And then on the 14-inch MacBook Pro, it also adequately cooled down the M1 Pro chip without even maxing out the fans. But watch what happens to the M2 MacBook Pro. During the export test, the fan was stuck at maximum 7,200 RPMs basically the entire time, hitting as much as 108 degrees Celsius multiple times, which is higher than we've seen even on Intel Macs. And since the fan was already maxed out, the system had no choice but to drastically cut back on the clock speeds, with the performance cores going from 3200 megahertz to 1894, the efficiency cores going from 2228 megahertz to 1444, and the GPU from 1393 to 289 megahertz, all within a split second, which caused the temps to drop from 108 degrees to around 84 degrees Celsius before restarting the cycle over and over again. And the craziest thing was that the M2 MacBook Pro cut the power to the M2 chip from around 29.5 watts all the way down to 7.3 watts, which is the most severe thermal throttling I've ever seen on any MacBook, including Intel MacBooks. And when it finally finished the test, it was drastically slower than the M1 Pro MacBook Pro, and it was only 10% faster than the previous M1 model, even though that model was GPU limited the entire time, which is disappointing because without thermal throttling, the M2 CPU is 18% faster and the GPU is 35% faster, so we should expect better performance in this test and not only just 10%. And now moving on to problem number 5, we have the SSD issue, which has basically blown up all over the internet. With the base model M2 MacBook Pro with 256 gigs of SSD, Apple chose to only fill one of the SSD spots on the logic board compared to the previous M1 MacBook Pro, which had both of the spots filled. And this is basically causing the transfer speeds to be drastically reduced as much as 2 times slower for the read speed compared to the previous M1 MacBook Pro. And the crappy thing about that is that it's going to slow down your large file transfers. It could potentially slow down the opening and loading of apps and games compared to the previous M1 MacBook Pro. But what really blew our mind was that this SSD is slower than Apple's iPad Air 5 with only a 64 gigabyte SSD, and that iPad starts at just $600 instead of $1,300 for the M2 MacBook Pro. And now for problem number 6, not only did Apple switch to 1 NAND chip instead of 2 on the base model, which instantly cuts away half of the channels, but the actual NAND chips themselves are worse quality than on previous MacBooks. And to prove this, we actually tested the 512 gig SSD model of the M2 MacBook Pro. So what we did is compare the M2 MacBook Pro to our previous 16-inch Intel 2019 MacBook Pro model that seems like it has slower SSD write speeds than the 512 gig SSD in the M2 MacBook Pro, according to the Blackmagic disk test. And we did a large file transfer, and we found that it finished faster on the old Intel model compared to this new M2 MacBook Pro with a 512 gigabyte SSD. And how is that possible? Well, it seems like Apple is starting to use lower quality SSDs that slow down more after a certain amount of data is transferred. Specifically, when the Intel 16 inches SSD slowed down, it continued to transfer at about 900 megabytes per second, which is pretty good. But on the M2 MacBook Pro's 512 gig SSD, once it slowed down, it went all the way down to an average of around 350 megabytes per second, which caused it to transfer the file slower, basically almost a minute slower. So what this essentially means is that Apple downgraded the quality of these new NAND SSD chips compared to the previous ones, which means that Apple is trying to save money. So we did a bit of research online and we found that a 256 gig flash NAND wafer costs apparently only $2.04 on the Chinese market, which was updated today as I'm filming this. So this shows that Apple is trying to squeeze every ounce of profit margin out of this M2 MacBook Pro in order to keep the base price at the same $1299 while upgrading it with the M2 chip. So from what it seems like, the supply chain and inflationary issues are probably worse than we think, with Apple making such a weird change going from 2 chips to 1 on the base model, ruining the performance. And in my opinion, Apple made a huge mistake and misjudgment by choosing to cut costs on this specific part of the MacBook Pro, particularly because of the 7th and final problem for this video. The slow 256 gig base SSD is negatively impacting the performance of the virtual memory swap. Because when the very low 8 gigs of RAM, which honestly shouldn't even be an option on the M2 MacBook Pro, when that fills up, it has to resort to the SSD to use as virtual memory. And the slower the SSD is, the slower that virtual memory is as well, which slows down performance. So we ended up testing this by opening 10 Chrome tabs in the background and then running a couple of real-world tests. And multiple times, the M2 MacBook Pro ended up being slower than the previous M1 MacBook Pro. This should never happen. The new model performing worse than the old model. This is embarrassing and it's a huge fail by Apple for choosing to go with just that one NAND chip. So with that said, I can safely say that Apple messed up badly with the M2 MacBook Pro, and the worrying part about all of this is that there's a good chance that the M2 MacBook Air also comes with the slow SSD issue, as well as likely suffering even more from thermal throttling issues. Not only in extreme tests like the one that we ran, but probably even in more of the common tests as well. So honestly, I've got to say that I'm a bit disappointed with the M2 MacBook Pro. So there you guys go. Those were the top 7 problems with the M2 MacBook Pro. And if you disagree with any of them, let me know down in the comment section below. But if you enjoyed this video and it was insightful to you, go ahead and click the circle above to subscribe, because we have a lot more testing to go, especially the M2 MacBook Air. And definitely check out one of those 2 right over there. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.